we're going to talk about automation in manufacturing today, but what I want you to focus on is the global part. Automation in manufacturing is happening everywhere in the world. It's happening in local markets, it's happening in regional markets, it's happening in global markets. We are interconnected, we are interdependent, we are international. It is very important for us as we talk about the Global Automation and Manufacturing Summit. You have seen tremendous automation and manufacturing technology at the show this week. What I want you to think about is that global aspect to it. It's very, very important that we understand that as manufacturing continues to grow, as new markets continue to open up, it's going to be that global nature of manufacturing that's going to create the greatest opportunity for us. And that's, for me, the exciting part of coming to this show every 2 years. It's the exciting part of going to Hannover Messe every year. It's exciting to see how global manufacturing continues to grow. And again, thanks to our event sponsors, and thanks to their efforts, we're able to be here today. And now that I have managed to tie my vacation into the opening presentation, I'm going to the back of the room and working up my new expense account. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jim. And I want to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Karen Kurek's been a great friend to Plant Engineering. She's been a great resource for the manufacturing industry and for Plant Engineering's readers. They've been very generous in sharing the information about the McGladrey monitor over the years. Karen is the partner with McGladrey LLP, head of the firm's the National Industrial Products Practice. She's the voice of manufacturing for McGladrey and its manufacturing professionals across the nation. The monitor is one of their key pieces of information. We have copies of the monitor at the back of the room as you're leaving at some point during the day, so we hope that you can pick one up and get even more information. Karen joined McGladrey in 2003 after 20 years with Arthur Andersen. She was a partner in their enterprise group. She's been a managing partner for the firm's employee and benefit assurance practices and its national growth and retention of women, or their GROW initiative. We are very pleased to welcome once again to our event this year, Karen Kurek. Karen?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me back. Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. Really appreciate it, and thank you for coming out this morning on such a dreary, rainy morning. You know, I live out in the western suburbs. I live in the Chicago area, and as I was driving in this morning, obviously traffic was slowed and stopped, and you know, I saw a lot of people texting in their car, and you know, in Illinois, it's actually illegal to text and drive. And you know, it's amazing. I have twin daughters, and I was taking one of them back to school last week, and she goes to school in Boston. And on the way back, and we drove, so coming back, it was a long trip, and I noticed in different states they have different things about not texting and driving. And you know, in Ohio, they have stay alive, don't text and drive. And in New York, they actually have tech stops where you can stop. They tell you tech stop in the next 5 miles, and you just, you know, it's like a rest stop without a bathroom, and you can text. But the most kind of parental note that I saw was in Massachusetts, and the sign flashed, and it said, your capital LOL, which means lots of luck, and OMG, which means oh my God, can wait. Put down your phone, and it had an exclamation point. So it was really kind of interesting just how the different states are dealing with this. All right, so just a couple of things. As I'm just wondering where I need to point to. Oops. Are the slides working? They're like moving on my thing here, but not. Oh, am I?
Technical difficulties first thing in the morning.
just do this now, yeah.
No, it's not. Can we have a little technical assistance here, because we're not?
I wonder if you reboot it again.
We love technology. You're not getting anything out of the clicker.
It's, well, if you put it back in slide mode.
There we go.
Let me just see if
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right.
You just have to
Sorry.
move from, yeah, I think it wasn't an actual slide presentation.
Oh, okay, great.
Thank you.
You're a genius, thank you. Okay, here we go. So anyways, just a little bit about McGladrey. You know, we've been around for a long time. We're the 5th largest accounting, tax, and consulting firm in the U.S., and we serve a lot of manufacturers, over 8,000 mid-sized manufacturers. And we're headquartered right here in Chicago. So what I wanted to do today is I want to talk to you a little bit about our McGladrey Monitor, which is a survey that we've been doing for the last almost 9 years. But before I do that, I want to give you just some context and want to go through a quick economic update. So this slide shows what's been happening with GDP on a quarterly basis. And, you know, in the second quarter, we actually had a pretty healthy increase in GDP. It actually increased 4%. And that was a big rebound because the first quarter of this year, GDP actually went down 2%. And if you remember, earlier this year, we had a terrible winter. We had the polar vortex, and that really disrupted a lot of things from consumer spending to transportation on the roads, and a lot of manufacturers had a hard time getting product to where they needed to get to. And also the polar vortex also had some unintended consequences. My niece is an OBGYN doctor, and she delivers babies for a living, and she tells me that in October of this year there's going to be a little baby polar vortex boom because in January and February everybody was stuck inside. So anyway, but what's happened though is in the second quarter of this year, the economy has picked up a bit, basically driven by consumer spending and also by inventory. Manufacturers have been increasing their inventory. And, you know, what's happening is, while we've had a good second quarter, it looks like that the GDP for this year is going to end up at about 1.6%. So, you know, ever since the recession stopped, we've really been kind of plodding along at pretty slow economic growth, at about a 2% rate per year. And I really call that growth rate really a turtle's gallop. It's kind of going forward, but it's just not as fast as everybody hoped it would be. But the good news is that when you look at the manufacturing sector, most manufacturers are cautiously upbeat about our growth. And you'll see this in the monitor in a little bit. But, you know, for those of you that track the ISM numbers just came out for August, and it was at almost at 60%. It was 59. That was the index, and that's been the highest, I think, since August of 2011. And you know, when I share these results, I really want to remind a lot of people that manufacturing is a really important part of our economy. It represents 12% of our gross domestic product, and it directly employs 12.5 million people and supports 17 million jobs. So the other thing that is also good to point out is the multiplier effect. So for every dollar that's invested in manufacturing activities, there's $1.32 in economic output that happens in other sectors. So a strong manufacturing sector makes for a strong U.S. economy. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening with unemployment. This chart shows a couple of things. It shows what's happening with the overall unemployment rate. That's the red line. And you can see that the unemployment rate came down to 6.1% in August. That was just released earlier this month. And, you know, that's good, but it's come down, but it's still high. And what's interesting is, you know, Canada's at about a 7% unemployment rate. The UK is at about 7. China's at about 5.8. But there's also some parts around the world that have pretty significant unemployment. For example, Spain. Does anybody want to guess what the unemployment rate is in Spain? It's 25.7. So it's, you know, so there's definitely some pockets in Europe that are definitely having challenges. But one of the things that this also shows is, you know, what happened during the Great Recession. And that's where manufacturers lost about 2 million jobs. So, and what's been happening is they've been steadily adding jobs back. Since the recession ended, they've added back about 800,000 jobs. And what's interesting is, you know, the manufacturing sector has really been leading the U.S. economy in bringing jobs back. And so, you know, a lot of things happened in the Great Recession since then. I mean, it was a very troubling time. There was a lot of consequences that happened after that. And I was listening to an economist a few months ago, and he said that the Great Recession was worse than divorce. He lost half of his assets, and he was still married. Anyway, he was an economist with a sense of humor. But, you know, one of the things when you take a look at those 800,000 jobs that have been added back, many of those have been in the transportation sector. So that sector and the fabricated metal products really kind of led the way in where the jobs have come back. And if you take a look at what states have been adding back jobs, what state do you all think that kind of led, you know, in those 800,000 jobs was the leader in adding back jobs? Wyoming? Okay. Got Wyoming. Any other guesses? Say it again? Oh, it wasn't Illinois. Actually, it was Michigan, not Illinois. It was Michigan. Actually, Illinois is way kind of down on the list. But as you can see, you know, Michigan, Texas, and some of the other Midwestern states, Indiana and Ohio and Wisconsin, have really been leading the way. So there's been a lot of activity, you know, in the traditional manufacturing sector that has been boding fairly well. But what's interesting is, you know, even though manufacturers have been adding back jobs, there still is a dire need for qualified workers. Skill shortages is still a really big issue. I was in Louisville, Indiana last week and talking to a group, and we were discussing this. And what's interesting is, while, you know, most people in America believe that manufacturing is important, and if a manufacturing facility comes in and creates jobs, they think it's great. However, parents are very unlikely to encourage their kids to go into manufacturing. In fact, today, 3 out of 10 parents would not encourage their kids to go into manufacturing as a career. And there's a lot of different dynamics, and I'm sure, you know, you've probably heard a lot about this, but, you know, for the past couple of decades, when you think about what's happened, the actual number of jobs in manufacturing has been reduced pretty significantly, and that's been in the media a lot. And we just don't have, you know, parents and our counselors at school encouraging kids to look for a career in manufacturing. And what is interesting is that, you know, we need to encourage more of our kids to go into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and also to consider, like, not everybody needs a 4-year degree. I mean, everybody wants to make sure they're educated, but there are a lot of really good jobs out there that you could get a 2-year degree in and have a good career. When you think about a lot of the students that come out of college with a 4-year degree, and they have something like a history major, they can't find a job. And, you know, you see a lot of history majors serving coffee at Starbucks. And so, you know, one of the things that the Manufacturing Institute is trying to do is to reach out to younger kids to encourage them to think about a career in manufacturing. And there's all kinds of things happening across the country with partnerships between manufacturers and the education, universities and community colleges and associations. So one of the things that they also show is that, there's really good jobs in manufacturing, and I think a lot of our younger people don't realize that. In fact, when you take a look at salary and benefits, on average, the manufacturing sector pays about 80 grand, and that's higher than the non-manufacturing sector by over $10,000. So, what's happening is there's kind of two things on the spectrum. There's the pipeline isn't getting filled up because there's a lot of kids choosing not to go into manufacturing. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of baby boomers that are about ready to retire. So, like in America, do you know what the average age of a welder is? 57 years old. So that's the average age. So, in some of those trades, we really need to get more things filled up in the pipeline. Okay. So Bob talked a little bit about globalization and what's happening in the global manufacturing sector. And let's talk a little bit about what's happening. What this slide shows is it gives you kind of a perspective on what's happening in manufacturing across the globe. And, in the United States, I mentioned that, the PMI numbers just came out last month. How many are familiar with the PMI numbers? Okay, so that's a pretty, it's an index that a lot of people take a look at. So what this shows is the green line is the global PMI index. So you can see that, it's above 50. And, then also the Eurozone is the blue line. And the United States is the black line. And you can see that the United States is really kind of leading the way in terms of the strength of their manufacturing sector. What's interesting is we've heard a lot about China, and earlier this year, China, especially last fall and in the spring, had a big slump. Their PMI went below 50, so their manufacturing sector was contracting, but over the past few months, it started to pick up again. So, the manufacturing sector in the United States is really an important part of what's happening globally. Another factor relates to export. So what's happening with U.S. manufacturers exporting product to around the world? If you remember a couple of years ago, President Obama challenged the United States to double our exports in the next 5 years. So that's kind of at a run rate of about 20%. Now we haven't reached that, but, and actually, over the past couple of years, exports have slowed down a bit. And let's take a look at some of the data. So what this shows, and take a look at just the total. So in 2012, the growth rate was almost 6% in exports. And then that went down to about 2.5% in 2013. And then year to date this year, we're at 1.1%. So what's happening is, our export growth rate is slowing. And a couple of things, if you take a look at what's been happening in South America, that's had a big impact. There's been a contraction in the economy, especially in Brazil, and that's had an impact on it. And, that's one of the things that everybody keeps on watching is what's happening with export growth. Okay. The other thing is, consumer confidence is also an important thing to watch because obviously 70% of our GDP relates to, consumers and consumer buying. And the good news is, consumer confidence continues to rise. In August, it was at 92.4%, and that sentiment is really the highest that it's been since the beginning of the recession. So that's a good thing for our economy. The other thing we take a look at is vehicle sales. So in July this year, vehicle sales, and this includes automobiles and light trucks, was about 16.5 million vehicles, which is good. And, over the past 20 years, that average per year is about 15 million, so we're ahead of the average. But what's interesting is this shows, what's been happening, since the Great Recession. We had like a big dip in car sales, and then there was this huge little, increase. Does anybody know what that related to, that little blip in the chart? Cash for clunkers, exactly. So there was a blip and then it went back down. But, the automotive industry has actually been good and been a very positive effect on the manufacturing space. Okay, one other thing we should take a look at is the housing market, because that's another important economic indicator. And what this shows is we'll just focus on the housing starts and housing permits. So, before the crash, before the recession hit, we were at a run rate of about 2 million housing permits and housing starts per year. And then what happened is that dipped drastically, and we were really kind of bumping along at about 500,000 per year. And that just wasn't much to get the housing market back on track. But since then, we've come up and we're at a run rate of about 900,000 housing starts and housing permits per year. But what's interesting is, the housing market has not come back as robustly as most people had hoped. And part of it is that, the people that are new home buyers in the 25 to 35 age category, a lot of those individuals are putting off buying a home for a lot of different reasons. One of the things is that it is, even though interest rates are at an all-time low, it's still very difficult to obtain a mortgage. So we'll take a look and see what's happening with that. Okay, so that's the overall kind of economic growth and what's happening on a high-level basis. So let's talk a little bit about the Manufacturing and Distribution Monitor. As Bob mentioned, there's a full copy of the report as you come in if you'd like to take a look at it. But we've been doing this for the past 9 years. And as I mentioned, we serve a lot of manufacturers and distributors. So, we want to understand what are some of the business issues that they're facing. And also, this is a large sample. We had over 1,200 participants participate in the survey this year. So these are CFOs and CEOs of privately held companies. And as I mentioned earlier, I have twin daughters, and when I told them that these were C-level executives that were participating in the survey, and they go, "Mom, what's a C-level executive? Somebody that's just average?" Which I thought was kind of cute. But what's interesting about it is that it is a large sample size, and it's privately held company, and it's really a unique data set. And this information has been shared not only with the participants and at forums like this, but also with members of Congress and also with members of President Obama's lead people on manufacturing. And, the survey asks a lot of different questions, everything from, employment data to data security to how companies are going to grow. And these are just some examples of some of the information that's in the report. But, what's interesting is over the past 5 years, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been asking this question. And what this shows is we ask the question at the beginning of when you take the survey, what's the current state of your business? Thriving and growing, that's in the blue. Holding steady, that's in the orange, or in decline. And as you can see, right after the recession, we've been seeing, steady growth in companies that are thriving and growing. And in fact, this year, 36% of the respondents are thriving and growing. And, those companies are experiencing higher sales growth, higher profitability, they're engaged in global commerce, and they're hiring more employees. And so what we did this year is we wanted to see, so what are these companies doing, these thriving companies, that allow them to thrive in an economy that's really growing at a pretty slow pace at 2%. And we found the following things. First of all, these companies set up a proper infrastructure. So this really lays the groundwork for everything else they do. So they tend to invest more in information technology, in machinery and equipment, and they're also very focused on R&D. So they start out with a great foundation. And then from there, their growth, they're looking at mergers and acquisitions, and also they're focused on innovation. On processes, continuous improvement is in the DNA of the culture. They are looking at ways to continuously improve what they're doing. Also on the supply chain, they look up and down the supply chain from the vendor to the customer and understand where value is created and ways to make it more efficient. And then external challenges. As you know, lots of government regulation, lots of things happening in the United States that manufacturers have to deal with, but they seem to be able to navigate some of those challenges better than others. So let's take a closer look at some of these 4 different areas. I mentioned infrastructure. So what we took a look at is the blue again is thriving, orange holding steady, and the green is declining. And you can see in each of these major areas, and in particular information technology, thriving companies tend to invest more in that, and they make better investment decisions. Thriving companies actually place a huge value on information, not only to tell them how their manufacturing operations are working, but also to get feedback. They have good feedback loops, and they also share that information with vendors and customers. And if we drill down a little bit in where they're investing in information technology, a couple of main areas are, upgrading their technology infrastructure, whether it's, going to the cloud or owning it themselves, and also upgrading their technology software. So those are a couple of things. And then what's interesting is we're also seeing a lot of investment going into mobility solutions. And so that relates to tablets and iPhones and how companies are utilizing that with their employees. And, there was one Seattle-based manufacturer that we were working with, and they were kind of an old school, and they basically did a web application so that 1,400 of their customers now can order for them online. And they can also get quotes, they can view the status of what's going on with their product and submit orders. So, the whole mobility solution, I think, came sooner to B2C activity, because you see a lot of different apps that are happening there, but we're also seeing more and more in B2B activity. I just want to, when you're talking about mobility and all these apps, this is kind of a side note. I was reading this article, and there was this woman from Texas, and she developed an app, and it's called Ignore No More. And what it is it makes it virtually impossible for somebody to ignore a phone call or a text. So she had a son that she constantly texts or tried to call, and he would never answer her text or call. So when you install this app, Ignore No More, and she calls him or texts him, if he doesn't respond back, the phone totally turns off. And he has to call her to get the password to restart it again. So anyway, there's all kinds of innovation happening out there. Okay, the other thing, as we're talking about IT, is this whole area of data security, and this is really interesting. There's been so many data hacks that have happened, and recently Home Depot, another one that was highly publicized was Target. And in the survey we asked, what do you believe that your data is at risk? And what's interesting is almost 59% of the respondents thought their data was at no risk or at very little risk of being hacked into. And this really is a false sense of security. A lot of times, so in our focus groups, we asked a lot of the folks, okay, so why do you feel that your data is not at risk? Some said, that's what I'm told. And I'm not sure who they told them, maybe their chief information officer. And some said that, well, I just don't think that hackers really are interested in my data. I don't have a lot of credit card information. I don't have a lot of social security numbers, although depending on how many employees you have, you do. And, that's really, hackers want to get into that information. And also, a lot of manufacturers obviously have intellectual property. And there was one company that we worked with, and they got hacked into. And what happened is, they had a fairly secure system, but have you all heard about the Internet of Things? So that's where kind of machines talk to each other. This company had a CNC machine, and it had a sensor on the CNC machine that was kind of measuring what was happening with the activity of the machine. A hacker got into that machine, or got into that sensor on that machine, and from there hacked its way into the main system. So they lost and got into the intellectual property and a lot of other things. So it's really important that this is something to keep in mind and to regularly monitor if somebody has hacked into your system. Okay, let's talk now a little bit about growth. Growth through mergers and acquisitions. What's interesting is those 36% of those companies that are thriving, 40% of them are looking to do an acquisition in the next 12 months. That's a pretty big percentage. And when we asked them, what they were looking for or why they were going forward to pursue an acquisition, a couple of the top things were to expand their market share and also to improve their market position. So there's a company actually here in Illinois that's a valve manufacturer, and they were primarily in the Midwest and made very large-scale valves. They bought a company out in California that had a different technology. It was still valves, but it was smaller and more precise, and it was used in the medical device industry. So what happened with this company is, with this acquisition, they expanded geographically, and they also got into a new sector, which was medical device sector. So we're seeing this, in general, people are looking to 40% are looking to acquire a company in the next 12 months. We also asked how many companies are looking to sell, and that number was only 8%. So we have 40% looking to buy companies and only 8% that are willing to sell. So that has a dynamic on what the multiples are for companies that are being sold. Okay, another thing that we've seen in terms of growth is that these thriving companies are really focused on innovation. And this is a picture of Thomas Edison at Menlo Park. And, Thomas Edison had a lot of inventions and created a lot of inventions. And also Thomas Edison manufactured a lot of his products. A lot of people don't realize that. But, with all of his inventions and intellectual property, he didn't invent them all himself. He basically did something what he called midnight lunch. And after the workday, he had some of his key engineers come together, and they had a very collaborative discussion on, depending on what the issue was and what their issues were and what their problems were, to get all of these guys to kind of focus in on helping them solve their problems. So they did it after hours. They went home for dinner. 7 o'clock, they came back, and then Thomas Edison provided them something to eat around 11 o'clock, hence midnight lunch. But one of the things that we also found is there was a manufacturer that was out in Washington State, and they had kind of their R&D folks and engineers all in different parts of the organization. When they moved to a new facility, they took all their R&D and engineers and put them into a common place, and so they were able to collaborate and do these things, and they really saw an uptick in the amount of R&D and innovation that was coming out of this organization. So again, in terms of thriving companies, they really are focused on growth through innovation, and not just innovating things in their products themselves, but also innovating things in their processes. So the other thing that we found is, in terms of continuous improvement, Deming came on board in 1985 with total quality management, and we still are doing lean manufacturing and all of those things today. And you know, when we were talking with some of the folks in our focus groups, they basically said with continuous improvement, we're never finished with this. We can always eliminate non-value added steps. And again, these thriving companies are taking TQM or lean manufacturing to the next level. Was one company in Minneapolis that they did TQM to their plant, their factory floor, and then after they got that done, they went to the back office. I actually toured their facility, and in their supply room, it was very organized, and they even had a certain place for their stapler, and I mean, it was kind of, you know, very organized. But now they're taking the whole lean manufacturing and doing it to their engineering process to look for ways to make that more efficient. So these companies are continuing to focus on this. On workforce, we talked about workforce. These companies tend to be able to attract talent better and also keep talent. And what we found in terms of the training that they do is they're also very focused on leadership and management development. So helping their employees learn how to lead a team, learn how to get proper feedback in a feedback loop and make changes. And it's very important, and they're investing a lot in workforce education and training. And then thirdly, we talked a little bit about this, is information technology. Not only are they investing more in information technology, but how they're using it, the functionality of it, they're even using it to improve customer satisfaction and also to minimize corporate risks, which, you know, the whole data risk that we talked about earlier. The next area is supply chain and how they work up and down the supply chain. And how many have heard of Stephen Covey? I mean, most people have. And one of his 7 principles was begin with the end in mind. And what these companies do is that they really spend time understanding their customer and what the customer's buyer values are. Why are you buying your product from me? I mean, that's the dialogue that they start with. And then from there, they take that understanding and move it back into their manufacturing space in terms of what needs to happen with their, you know, product innovation, process innovation, all the way up to their suppliers. They're working very closely with their suppliers to make sure that they have on-time delivery, they're negotiating the correct prices, and also that their processes kind of mirror, the supplier's processes kind of mirror the manufacturer's processes. I was in Peoria a few months ago visiting the Caterpillar plant, and you know, Caterpillar has a lot of middle market manufacturers. Caterpillar has been focusing on, you know, lean manufacturing, total quality management, you know, for the last several years. And what they have started to do now is take that concept and move it up their supply chain to manufacturers that supply them so that they're speaking the same language, they have similar information systems, and they're able to work more collaboratively together. Also with supply chain, we also take a look at, so where should you source where you manufacture your product? And what we found is that, you know, we've been asking questions about offshoring for the last several years in the survey. And what we've seen over the last, you know, 3 to 4 years is that the tendency for companies to offshore, meaning taking their manufacturing operations and moving them somewhere outside of the United States, has actually decreased. And we've just recently been asking, so what's happening with onshoring? So that's bringing back manufacturing operations to the United States. And we noticed that for the past 2 years, about 7% of the participants said that they actually onshored operations back to the United States. And looking forward, almost 10% said that they were going to onshore operations. So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. You know, to make a decision to bring operations back to the United States is a very complicated one. Sometimes, you know, if you have equipment or a business in China, you can't even get the, you know, machinery back. So it takes a very comprehensive analysis to see if it makes sense. But what's happening is there are a lot of compelling factors in the United States that are incenting companies to move back. One is that, you know, if they're serving primarily a U.S. market, they're closer to their customers. And customers are asking for things faster. The lead times are much shorter. Also, if you take a look at the supply chain, you know, if you have something manufactured in China or somewhere halfway around the world, it's much more difficult to manage that supply chain than if it's in the United States. And also, what's interesting is we've also seen that something that's manufactured in the United States tends to have better quality. And that's very important in a part that needs to be precisionally machined and a precise engineering in it. And so we've seen more things coming back. And then also energy costs. What's happening with energy costs, they're continuing to come down given the fact of what's happening with natural gas in the United States and the horizontal drilling. And that's going to continue to have a big impact on manufacturers because manufacturers use 1/3 of all the energy in the United States. So when those costs come down, it makes it more advantageous to manufacture things here in the United States. You know, some people believe that by 2020, we will be energy independent in the United States. The other thing that was interesting that we asked, this whole thing about quality of products that are manufactured in the USA, we asked some questions around that, and 75% of the participants believed that it was important to their brand to state that the product was made in the United States. There was a Seattle-based manufacturer of garage doors, and they sell their doors to Canada as well as the Middle East and Australia and New Zealand. And you know, they compete with a Chinese manufacturer of garage doors in those marketplaces. And the Chinese product is less expensive, but what the CEO of this company said is that they've been able to increase market share when they indicate on the garage door that it's made in the USA. It's more expensive in the purchase price, but the quality of it, it actually is a very positive thing for their brand. Okay, so the last area that we kind of looked at was, you know, what's happening externally, external challenges that are affecting your growth. And we asked this question, you know, how are the following external issues affecting your company's growth? And these were the top issues that were identified as affecting their growth in a negative way, that these 5 factors came up as things that were going to limit their growth. What do you think came to the top of the list? Which one? Availability of workforce, competition from other companies, government regulations, material and component pricing, or taxation? Any guess? Say it again? Interesting. Workforce did not come up as the first one. The first one that came up was taxation, closely followed by government regulations. Actually, workforce was the 5th one on the list, which really surprised us. But you know, what this slide shows is it also shows, you know, the impact on thriving companies versus holding your own versus in decline. And you can see while taxation and government regulation is still very high for all 3 of those factors, including thriving companies, thriving companies somehow are able to navigate through the government regulations and taxation better than the other folks. And, you know, part of it is, I think they have an in-depth understanding of their business fundamentals, and they can kind of anticipate it, and it really allows them to be more nimble in participating with these, or dealing with these factors. But again, both taxation and government regulation are concerns for all companies. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But one of the things in government regulations is the Affordable Care Act. And I know, last year, the last 18 months, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion about this. And what's interesting is that, most companies are planning to, in the manufacturing space, are planning to comply with the Affordable Care Act. And I think part of it relates to the competition for skilled workforce. And most manufacturers offer health care right now. So they're not going to pull back health care just because of a new law. Most are going to comply and make sure that they're providing health care for their employees. But we found that thriving companies, almost 80% of them are planning to comply with the Affordable Care Act. And when we also asked, all right, so what are some of the ways that that you're going to help kind of manage the costs? And really what they're doing is looking to provide incentives for their employees for healthy living. They're also focusing on wellness programs and looking for ways to really drive down the premium costs. So I was at an event, this was in Evansville, Indiana, and what this one company does is, in order to lower their health care costs for the individual employee, they basically pay for all of their employees to join a health club. There's a health club in their area, and they have certain things that they can do, like walking, or they have an actual program. And once they hit certain goals in the program, they bring the form back to the employer, and then the employer gives them 5% off their insurance premiums that they have to pay. And the other thing is that not only does the employee get 5% off, but since the company is having a healthier workforce, their premiums have gone down. So there's all these creative ways that companies are trying to look to deal with the increasing costs of government regulations. But just a couple of other things on government regulations. The Congress approval rating right now is at 15%. So 15% of Americans are approving what is happening in Congress. And I believe that's at a 3-decade low. And, what's happening is that Congress cannot pass legislation. In fact, last year there was one piece of legislation that was passed by both the House and the Senate. And does anybody know what legislation that was? It was to keep the government open. Remember when the government was going to shut down? So, there's a lot of things happening or not happening in Washington, D.C. And so since things are not getting legislated, what's happening is that the EPA and other government regulatory bodies are, moving forward and kind of overstepping their bounds. But just, this is something just to take a look at, And I think that at the crux of this issue with what's happening in Congress is, depending on what side of the aisle you sit on, what this shows is the red line is the percentage of GDP that's government expenditures, and that's at 22.7%. And some people believe that that's just too high and that we have to lower government spending. On the other side of the aisle, when you take a look at the blue line, 18.4%, that's the percentage of federal revenues that relate to the GDP. And some people think that's just too low and we need to raise taxes. So, hence we're at a gridlock. There's not a lot happening in Congress. And that, again, is the consequence of that is that some of these government agencies are kind of overextending some of their rules. Somebody once told me that if pro is the opposite of con, then progress is the opposite of Congress. I thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, just a few more things that we took a look at. And for those companies that were thriving, we asked, all right, so what have been the impact of your investments on your operations, production process? And these thriving companies see more improvement in their strategic investments in every single category, from operational effectiveness to sales lead generation. These thriving companies outperform the other folks. And part of it is that they do more planning, but they also have good feedback loops on what's working and what's not working. And if it's not working, they're nimble enough to make changes to move forward. Also, their investment in IT is paying off. In terms of utilizing IT to improve customer satisfaction, they're even more effective in this area than their counterparts. And there's, lots of different examples of how they're doing that. So, the thing is that when we take a look at, we ask questions on, what's going to happen in the next 12 months in terms of your sales. Thriving companies are anticipating a 12% increase, where all others are about an 8% increase in sales. In terms of employees, they're looking to expand their workforce further, 9% versus 5%. So there's a lot of things that are good happening in these companies, and the report itself really dives more deeply into these best practices. And as I mentioned, they're making investments in their infrastructure. They're making, the right bets on where they're going. They're growing through strategic acquisitions. They're expanding their market share faster than their colleagues. They're also staying very innovation-focused, being very collaborative within the organization and also up and down the supply chain. It's really in their whole DNA to not only be collaborative, but look for ways to improve. And they're also working with their suppliers to really enhance the value that they're bringing to their customers. They're working up and down the supply chain. And then in terms of external challenges, they understand what they are, and they just seem to manage them better than their counterparts. So again, there's a copy of the report. I don't know if they're out. You can go to our website, which I'll show you in a minute. But in addition to that report, that's really like the global edition, we also have industry sector reports. We also have geographic reports. We included Mexico and Brazil this year in the report. We have a separate report. I'm actually going to Mexico in a few weeks to launch their report there. And we also have customized reports for the actual participants themselves and for associations. So with that, do we have time for a couple questions?
I think both for you and for us, it's probably a good time to break. But,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And,
One question?
okay, one.
One calling in. Well, if not, we'll make the video of this will be available, and we'll make sure that you have a way of getting in touch with Karen throughout the course of the process. Thank you all very much.
Right.